Hello everyone and welcome to today's Safety Institute of Australia webinar. Today's discussion is on cognitive fatigue and other brain-centered hazards. We are pleased to welcome our presenters for today, Warren Smith and David Musgrave. About DECRA. DECRA is a global organization whose mission is dedicated to safety on the road, at work and at home. They have over 45,000 employees serving a multitude of high-risk industries. DECRA's consulting business specializes in helping clients evolve both their organizational culture and their operational environment to empower businesses to reduce injuries, save lives, and protect assets. Today's thought leaders. David Musgrave, Vice President, Consulting Leader. David leads DECRA's brain-centric reliability group and focuses on creating customized performance solutions based in applied neuroscience and human error reduction consultations. BCR fosters strong performance reliability through a systematic approach of designing and enhancing workplaces and processes, all with the human brain in mind. Warren Smith, Executive Consultant. Warren is a safety, leadership, and culture expert with 3 decades of experience in designing and manufacturing organizational performance improvement programs that deliver measurable results. Warren specializes in serious injury and fatality and human performance reliability. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to post questions to the presenters through the presentation by clicking on the dark blue hand icon in the top right corner of your screen. If you are experiencing any technical issues during the webinar, please dial our support team on 1-800-733-416. This number is also listed at the bottom of your page. I'd now like to pass you over to Warren to begin.
Thanks, Jordan. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone online. Just what we'll be covering today, we're going to talk about what human performance error means and some of the myths associated with how the brain works. We'll also look at the dangers of working in autopilot and work through how fatigue can significantly increase the risk of injury. Now finally, David's going to be sharing some of the things we can do to address these hazards. But I have a small request right up front, which is that before handing over to David, please, I'll reinforce what Jordan said, ask lots of questions today, because even though we might get a chance to answer 3 or 4 or 5 of them during the session and toward the end of it, we should be able to get back to you with some responses to any other questions that you ask. So please don't be hesitant in responding, with anything that comes to mind. So I'm going to hand over to David now.
Well, thanks so much, Warren, and thanks for everyone for joining us here today to talk through some interesting information, useful information around human performance reliability. So the question of the day, you'll see on the slide here, why do good people get it wrong? Always interesting. Human beings are pretty good at getting things correct. It's just here and there we will get things wrong. And so when it comes to sort of workplace safety, what we're really wanting to look at in particular is where are those sort of critical paths where we really need to get things right 100% of the time. And yet that's not necessarily human nature to be able to do that just by our design, the design of our brain, that sort of thing. We'll just wait for our slide to catch up here. I think it's a delay from here in America. When we look at, why does a worker miss important information, given that it's known to be important information, what makes it interesting, we think, is that, again, it comes down to human nature, people missing things that they know are important and are attempting to pay significant attention to, but at the same time, it's just sort of how we go, if you will. We get things wrong occasionally, even though folks are good at their job. When we DECRA had sort of initially gone into the forte of human performance, sort of indirectly, back in 2004, the NASA folks had actually asked us to have a look around within their organization, given there were some challenges that they were having, that were quite public. And so we interviewed several hundred people and surveyed just under 20,000 people within the NASA organization to figure out really what's going on there to lead to some of these critical errors. Pretty resounding. What we heard back then was focused on, well, no, people do speak up and people do notice sort of the pathway to error. However, what was noticed within that business was really that in some ways the message that sort of sent upward wasn't executed in the way that those waving the flag would have wanted. When we look a little bit more closely and through a human performance lens, it makes sense. So once folks realize that they are speaking up and making suggestion, as soon as they and their brain gets the cue that this information is running contrary to what other people think, the brain picks up on these cues pretty quickly and will learn to sort of quiet down. So those that were, raising their hand in disagreement may pretty quickly learn, the best idea is to, go quiet. Very subtle, and the brain picks up on these sort of subtleties. Particularly what we're talking about here is the social brain, which is several physical structures in the human brain that really just intend for human beings to kind of go along and get along with each other. So we sort of stick with our tribe, we stay together. And this worked really well for many years. When it comes to this particular part of the brain can sort of lead us a bit astray along the way. So there's things that we can do to sort of take better control over the social brain. But this was sort of our first foretaste really formally into human performance, having worked in safety for several decades. If we click down and have a look at more traditional approaches to, why is it that we think that people get things wrong, what we notice is what we would call the 3 I's approach. And so you may have seen this in your organization as well. Hopefully it's well and truly behind you, but it's pretty common to at least have some folks still speak to these, hopefully not pervasive, but have a look here. So the first one, ignorance. So the reason that this error happened is it's lack of knowledge, lack of know-how. So, people don't know. Maybe we trained them, they didn't catch it. Is the way that it can be spoken about, unfortunately. Or maybe it's the number 2 on the list, ineptitude. They'll never know. The whispers or the eye rolls that can be, people don't get it. Of course, this person got it wrong. This sort of thing. And then the last one, indifference. If only people cared more. If people cared, like I care about how things get done around here, then these incidents, errors wouldn't have happened. And so these are a little bit deceptive. I was in a meeting the other day and I actually heard, sort of sitting around a boardroom table, and I actually heard some of this come up, not explicitly, just a whisper, and just by somebody sort of referencing one of these, it potentially can get the whole team off of addressing, the real issues, the sort of more systemic issues, because if we're pegging it onto one person and that there's something wrong with this person, or that team, or that department, we can get into trouble pretty quickly here. And then there's not really any focus on the system and what needs to change. It's really just about broken people or bad apples, of course. So we're going to move away from these 3 I's. And if we click to the next one, what we see is another I. And so really comes down to what we would call errors of inconsistency. Human beings are great at making it happen. When you look at the technology innovation all around the world that's ongoing, it's just amazing to see what human beings and our brains can sort of generate to make the world go round. But we do get things wrong sort of occasionally, and there's obviously many examples where really nasty things have happened, from injuries to all the way through to catastrophes. But it often boils down to the fact that we're quite inconsistent in the way that we perform. So while we might do something well one day, maybe the next day something else has come up to sort of get us off that, if you will. The way that we at DECRA talk about this is to sort of normalize this and talk about it from a standpoint of what we would call brain-centered hazards. You'll see the definition here on the slide. It's the sort of natural function of the human brain that can get us into trouble sometimes. And so it's not about that person or that that something wrong with that person or that team. It's really what are we doing in terms of knowing about how the human brain kind of steers us in the wrong direction occasionally, and what are we doing as a business to kind of get our hands around that. You'll see the second point here as well, where it says these are internal hazards that are precursors to human performance errors. So it's a good way to look at these. They really are sort of precursors. They come before something nasty that might happen. When we click to the actual sort of list of brain-centered hazards, you'll see we've captured these in terms of 7 brain-centered hazards. So what we've tried to do here is we've taken sometimes what can be some fairly convoluted and highly academic human performance research and condensed it to a place where it can be used really operationally. Some of the things on the screen here will jump out to most of our attendees on this webinar as being, of course, these are obviously precursors to error or potential error. And at the same time, when we look within businesses, what we see is there's often quite a few gaps where these are under-addressed or they're not addressed at all, or even potentially the business is not aware of how are these 7 brain-centered hazards impacting on the business. We will often do work specific to kind of identifying, kind of looking in the rearview mirror at some incidents. You'll see on the slide an example, 180 incidents reviewed, but reviewed specifically for these 7 brain-centered hazards. Yeah? And so doing this kind of a review can create a bit of a call to action if it's not already occurred within a business, to look at the fact that yes, we're pretty good at managing the physical hazards. We have many things in place to help keep energy off of people, including spinning blades and fall hazards and all those things. But what about the brain-centered hazards? What about the internal hazards that we all bring to work with us potentially on a daily basis, and how are these being managed? What you'll see here for this particular organization, you'll see that on that top line there where we say fast brain hazards, this can also be referred to as System 1 thinking, or really we're not consciously focused, we're not consciously thinking. We're instead in sort of a automatic pilot mode, habitually operating. In this case, 53% of the incidents, the 180 that we had to look at anyway, 53% of those were really obviously related to someone could have paid attention but did not. Now again, the idea is not to point at the person and say, well, you should have paid attention. That's not good enough. It's really about what is it within the business that we've not addressed this, because of course, somebody missed something, didn't pay attention, and that's led to an incident. Anyone in that situation would be susceptible to such a thing. So you can see here, when you've got half of your incidents related to this, that's a little bit of a call to action. You can see sort of how it cascades down. For this client, just to point them to some of the more obvious things to address right away. Within our short time here today, we won't be able to talk through all 7 of these hazards. That would take a while to do that. But I thought we would just have a look at a couple of these, and in particular, we'll have a look at cognitive fatigue, since it's a focus of this webinar as well. Now, when we skip down to the slide with the good old Swiss cheese model, an oldie but a goodie. So there's many models that can be used to sort of depict, how we address hazard and risk along the way. So when you see here some of the labels above various slices of cheese here, What we're really talking about is, what are the layers of protection that a business has put in place. Every business puts them in place and has things in place to keep people safe. And so what we see is working with some of the largest businesses globally is even businesses that spend, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars on making sure that people are kept safe and well. Even then, there are still some holes in the cheese, so to speak, and some gaps. We just take a quick example here, but from a human performance standpoint. So when we look, let's go straight in the middle of this slide where it says pre-task safety briefings. Just use that as an example. So of course, I'm sure we would all agree that not every pre-task safety briefing or meeting is of the same quality as the next one. It's pretty common to have some variability there. So that's a hole or gap in itself. I'm for sure that it's important to address that. But also when we look through the lens of human performance, we had just quickly overviewed the concept of brain-centered hazards. How are we talking about brain-centered hazards, those precursors to human performance error? How do we talk about those within that meeting? And does everybody do that? And does everybody understand that it's a pretty big requirement, given that they show up in most of the incidents that we see happening? And so it's important to address those really proactively. That's not something we can just ask people to do. We have to teach people, all about these 7 hazards, and which ones, for this job today or the jobs we're doing today, which ones might be at play as well. When you look at this slide, human performance defenses and countermeasures. Our approach to human performance, based on our work with multiple clients, is really specific. What we've devised from a DECRA point of view is different than how many other people approach human performance. In some ways, it's quite similar, but one important difference is what we noticed is that about half of the folks that ring us for help in the human performance space already work and do fairly elaborate things in the human performance space. And the reason that they ring us oftentimes is because most of that work is to do with that last bullet point there, where you'll see where it says individual and team reliability capabilities. This is really a domain that's really important, but it's really about teaching people, developing capability within people and teams, including leadership folks, around human performance and how we strive to get things right and enable people to do it well. Super important. But what we see is that's where the bulk of the effort tends to go, and the change effect is not often what people would expect. I had a senior leader in an automotive manufacturing business recently say to me, "You know what, David, we've been working in this space, in the human performance space, for 3 years now, and I still don't understand what we're doing, and we're not seeing a result from it." And so that's not uncommon. It doesn't mean that the work that's been done is wasted. It just means it's not sufficient in the way that human beings come to find their way to success. It's important to address these other 2 bullet points here, these other 2 buckets, super important. So let's have a look at those as well. So let's go on the top, organizational alignment on risk. So most common what we see, and again amongst the best and brightest in the industry from around the world, what we see is that there's often a misalignment from a risk perception point of view. That is, people are making decisions at all levels in the business that are not aligned. When we look at incidents, that's what we see as well. Someone made a decision, again, not to blame a person, but someone's come to this particular decision that we would all agree was not the best one. And so when we have a look at why that is, we come back to sort of competing messages and sometimes confusion around what's most important here. Most of the time when people get things wrong from a decision-making point of view, they're often a little bit conflicted. They might be by themselves or in a team, but they're conflicted between 2 or more really important things that they know are important, but they're having trouble to sort of please both of them. The most common one that comes up, obviously, is, I want to get this task done, but I'm seeing that there's an issue that's come up that would take some time for me to do it safely. So what do I do? It's easy to say, well, we focus on safety. That's the most important thing. But when we're honest, there's a lot of competing messages that are out there, really close to the sort of working interface, as we would call it, where the work gets done. That would occasionally have people drift into making a decision that's really not the best one. Another example could be, I see that there's a small environmental spill just over here. If I catch it now, even though I don't have training or proper equipment to do that, but I could clean that up really quickly, and I'm sure that'll be fine. And the reality is, when you're putting yourself at risk to do that, and the business has not asked you to do that. So we thank you for your dedication, but just another example of some misalignment. Again, most decisions are aligned, and that's the good thing, but usually there's more work to be done in this area around value-based decision-making, so that people are viscerally responding to sort of what's the right thing to do here in the moment. That's that top bucket. The second bucket there, brain-aligned work processes. This is really looking at, systemically, how can we adjust the work for the worker, if you will. Just a couple of examples listed there. It's not an exhaustive list, but when we look at SOPs, and we had done some polling some time ago, asking about SOPs, how often do people skip steps, use the wrong, this sort of thing, sort of get it wrong in terms of applying an SOP, a safe operating procedure. And so it's pretty normal for people to get it wrong. Sometimes they're convoluted, they sort of go on and on, they have all kinds of notes. It may not be clear and concise. And so one way to improve the likelihood that folks doing the work will find success is to make sure the SOP is what we would call brain aligned. That is, it's meant for human consumption. And it reduces the likelihood that an error will be made. Yeah, no silver bullet there, of course. So it's a layer of protection to improve the quality of SOPs, as an example. We can do the same thing with training. So that doesn't matter if it's safety training, HR training, the approach to training. For all the money that's spent on training, what we see is that often people didn't actually learn within the training, or can't recall, or can't apply what they were meant to learn. Again, that's not their fault. It's often to do with the design of the actual training. Human-machine interface, pretty straightforward. Focus on human performance there. How do people interact with equipment in important ways? And the last one, event learning. I suppose this one has many names. So the way that businesses do investigations, do they rely on best practices as they really learn from each one of the events that have happened here? So infusing human performance into investigations to make sure that we're sussing out what actually happened here. And so using science to do that, to get even better results, really proactively, and then also after the fact, should there have been an incident as well. So just some examples there. But a common example that I would leave you with from that particular slide is really around, you could train people, let's say in fatigue risk management, which is a great thing to do, teaching people about how much sleep they need, what happens if you don't get it, which we're going to get into a little bit here in a few minutes. But if you didn't address some of the systemic issues, that is, if you work for a business that doesn't have a fatigue risk management policy, or doesn't devote a lot of energy to that, or make good decisions around making sure people are well rested while they do their job, what you've really done is just given people information, but it's harder for them to use it where they work currently. That's why we take the sort of systemic approach with those three buttons there. What you'll see on this slide here in terms of the human brain, for many years, we would think the human brain kind of operates like a computer. You put information in, it spins around, information comes out in the form of decisions, things like that, actions. What we know now is that the human brain is really broken down into sort of four kind of main functions. There's lots of ways to talk about this, but this is what we thought we would bring along here for today. If we start at the bottom there, the autonomic system, the basics of the brain. So this is regulating your heartbeat and your body temperature, just the basics for survival. No thinking, not a thinking part of your brain there. If you jump up there where it says fast brain, this is our habitual processing. This is not a thinking part of the brain, and yet we use this part of the brain a significant amount of time, up to 50% of our day. Varies depending on what you're doing and all kinds of things like that. But we are meant to not sit and perseverate and be deliberative about what we're doing every moment of the day. This is a way to conserve energy, so we have our fast brain, or System 1 thinking, if you will. If you jump up to the top there, you'll see two other components. The slow brain, the best part of the brain. So you'll see it's pointing to that red part right up the very front there. And this would include our prefrontal cortex. It's the smartest part of the brain. It's where good decision-making comes from. It's where planning and focus comes from as well, with regards sort of setting up safety for success. And there's that social brain, again, as we had mentioned before, kind of runs sort of like a set of earmuffs from one ear to the other on the outer surface of the brain. This is our social brain. Again, it's really there to have us stay with the tour and not do anything too rash that would draw attention to us and have us be part of the out group, if you will. It's meant to save our lives and keep us well for many, many years, where we see now some issues from a brain-centered hazard point of view where people may not speak up. The social brain may say, I wouldn't say anything if I were you. Maybe you shouldn't raise your hand so quickly, as we had mentioned in the NASA example. A few more points here, just specific to the way that we process risk as well. Just a couple here. We could spend the whole day talking about this particular component. But what you'll see here is recognition of exposures and risk often fail given brain-centered hazards. And we'll talk about the human vision system as an example in just a second. But we often miss things sort of right off the bat. You can't address what you haven't seen. There's a lot of talk about situational awareness, and the way people talk about that is not fully accurate in some cases. So we want to be honest. People miss things, and there's things that we can do as individuals, and there's things that businesses can do to help us notice important things more often. Yeah. The second point there, repeated exposure to risk without consequences reduces emotional red flags in the brain about unwanted outcomes. So not really a surprise there, but our thalamus is designed to sort of wave that red flag that says, this is not okay, I need to do something differently here, I need to pause work, I need to stop. And so the more often that we don't actually do that, and we're around uncontrolled exposure and working in elevated risk, the thalamus realizes, okay, so this I must be wrong, this is not risky. Because you're not taking any action, and nobody's been hurt based on this. So the brain's always learning what to draw attention to. While this point is made specific to safety, we could just as likely apply this to why people have marital problems sometimes. I should have paid more attention here, but everything seems to be fine, so I won't give my relationship the attention it needs. And then we see a result that's undesirable at times. Me, as a recovering psychotherapist, I can tell you all about it. So we want to make sure that we're remaining reactive to increases in exposure wherever we are in life. The third point there, risk-taking is contagious. So no secret that if we're working in a team and other people are doing things that are high exposure and then leaving it going unmanaged, risk is high, our brain will start to, the social brain in particular, will kick in and say, I bet you this is fine. I bet you it's just me that's overreacting and thinking that this is not appropriate. And so we often will hear this whisper within our head that says, don't make a fuss, you don't need to address this. Because the rest of the group seems to be going along with it. It's often why supervisors, managers, executives will walk up on a group of folks that are working in a way that's not so safe and be sort of surprised by that. It's actually not that surprising because to the group it seems fine. The brain has learned that this is okay. The last point which we're going to talk more about in just a few minutes, to do with cognitive fatigue. Cognitive fatigue, there's many types of fatigue: physical fatigue and mental fatigue. Mental fatigue coming from just sort of sitting, staring at a monitor potentially at your desk, and you feel a bit drained. But cognitive fatigue is all about sleep deprivation. So we've not slept, we've not had enough high-quality restorative sleep to sort of recharge our brain so that we can have good situational awareness and engage and focus and all those good things to do with our slow brain. One of the interesting things to do with cognitive fatigue, you'll see here within the bullet point at number 4 there, you'll see perceived personal gain. So there's a focus on, we're a bit selfish when we're fatigued. I just want to get this job done so I can get out of here. And so we often don't notice that. We may not even notice our own fatigue, but it's important to notice that this is where corner cutting can happen, just based on the way that the brain is trying to rush you through the process. As is with alcohol, if you ask somebody that's had a lot of alcohol to drink, are you okay to drive? Very often they will say yes, even though they're not. Same thing with fatigue. So when organizations are asking questions like, are you okay to stay over, or are you too tired? That's not the best way to be assessing for fatigue, obviously. There's more clever things that we can do to make sure we get a good decision there. What we thought we would do is just pop into a few of the brain-centered hazards, just to do a bit of a tour through those as we make our way to cognitive fatigue as well. So let's do that now. First one on our list here is the fast brain, as we had talked about before. A few tidbits there, a few facts about the fast brain to share as well. And you'll see we use it a lot. It saves a lot of energy not to think and just operate habitually, which is not a bad thing. If you took a shower this morning, you would have likely not thought about that, which is completely fine. So this is a way for the brain to save energy in low-exposure, low-risk situations. What we want to watch out for in particular is when does the fast brain sort of get overused. In safety-critical situations, the brain will often prompt us just to use that because it's learned, you're good at your job, you know what you're doing, and so off we go. What we also notice is, I'm doing some work right now with a work site where this is actually the most experienced team I've ever worked with on Earth. So most people that work in this business, thousands of people, have decades and decades of experience. They're so good at what they do. However, they've just experienced, after sort of years of exemplary safety performance, what they're now experiencing is things like fatality and really serious injuries, seemingly out of nowhere. And so when we look more closely through some assessment work that we had done, this is one of the things that came up, was that a lot of examples of people just relying on habit, just sort of going through the motions, because people are so good at their job, the brain says, you don't need to think about this, you don't need to pay attention here or do any elaborate planning, you can just get it done. And because for years you've done well in this regard. So just some watch outs there. We love our fast brain, but it is on the hazard list for a reason. What we've also seen is in the transportation industry, as an example. You'll see an image here pop up of some folks driving a train. And so incidents that can come up with regards, driving a train kind of monotonously down the track. When a critical error happens, what the operator often will say is the signal that would have directed me was actually saying green. It's fine for me to continue here or to make a switch. And in fact, because this is recorded, it was red. But when the operator says it's green, it's not because they're confabulating that or trying to save their job. Their brain literally saw green because it's always green there. And so if we're in fast brain mode, we often will see what we expect to see, so to speak. And so there's some things that can be put in place to help folks in situations like this, where there's a transition point where we really need our slow brain to switch on, and that's not going to happen automatically. So we need to put something in place to help people be more successful in situations like that. And of course, fail-safes. If it's ever possible to put a fail-safe in place to have that just occur automatically, that's the best way to go. Not always possible, but it go. When we look on the slide with the green light, I think we could all kind of agree that if you're sitting at a red light and the car next to you that's meant to turn is their light turns green, we would all have identified that we would just move a little bit, so we start to go ahead, but our light is actually still red. Just a little reminder that we are probably in fast brain here, so we weren't paying attention, but our brain is very susceptible to cues. So it saw that green, it just assumed it was for us, and so that's what's happened there along the way. So the next time you're at that green light, or you're at that red light and you feel that move, just take that as a reminder that you probably should use your slow brain to proceed through this intersection, given it's a higher exposure moment. It would be very difficult to be in your slow brain all of the time while you drove. And in fact, I don't even talk about that with professional drivers. I talk about when do we want to be in slow brain? When do we need to focus? What are those transition points, higher exposure points within our route for the day? Yeah. When we look at our slow brain, really all the good things that come along with the slow brain, maintaining attention, controlling impulses, solving problems, all the things that sort of make us human. This is our slow brain, and we want to use this more often. That's great to say, but we could also look at an example of, okay, well, what could we do about it from a combating the hazard point of view? If we are wanting to do more to take control, this is not by any stretch an exhaustive list, but some ideas, and you may already be using some of these ideas where you work, but providing some prompts or nudges to guide employees towards safe actions. We've all, within our facilities, even done little things like having the little footprints on the floor that guide people to where they want to walk. Well, people don't have to walk on those footprints or even in that direction, but the brain will pick up on those cues. It would take them, and you'll just naturally sort of stay with that. Same with lines painted on a walkway. It's a guide. It's a nudge to keep people, to help keep people in the lane that they're meant to be in. Yeah? You can take that concept and really blow it out into solving a lot of human performance kind of gap areas. How do we help people get things right more often? I'll give you just a quick example. So working with some people that they were going to be a little bit delayed in installing air conditioning into a very hot and very large, expansive space. And their intention was to do that, but it would cost several $1 million to do that, and it would take some time to do that as well. And here we are in the middle of summer in this case. So some of the things, I'll give you one of the things that we put in place, which didn't cost any money, and it's just really easy and it worked, there's a lot of campaigns around drinking more water, staying hydrated, pretty typical things that we would have all done and seen. But easy things to do, it can be around making sure that hydration is adequate and available everywhere, but also the size of the glass. What I noticed was these great big burly gentlemen, in some cases, drinking out of these little tiny cups, little triangle cups, like a sparrow sort of sipping water, because they weren't allowed to have a larger sort of personal cup in the space that they worked, just for hygiene and other reasons. So instead what we do is we triple the size of the cups, if you want, and they were actually able to measure the water consumption that people took on board. Nobody made anybody drink more water. It's just a good idea and make it easy for people, and they tend to do the right thing. So that's a tiny little example, but they didn't have any heat-related issues that year, even though they're in a really hot environment. So things that can be done in that regard. You'll see some other tidbits here on the slide. I won't read them all for you. We'll move on to the next one. If we move on to vision-centered hazards. So vision-centered hazards really all to do with the way that the human brain misses things. Yep. So we are designed to miss things. No surprise there, I hope. But what you'll see on this slide is something that we call seeing as suspect. Yeah? We see with our brain, not with our eyes. So our eyes don't show us everything. They're not like cameras that just record everything. They go on sort of looking missions, whether we like it or not, or whether we've set the mission or not. And so what we know is that the brain will show us what we asked for. And so I spend a lot of my time helping businesses be careful what you ask for. You know, so let's say when an executive or a group of supervisors say, "Hey, Dave, let's go for a walk, a safety walk, and see what we notice," I right away say, "Let's not." I'm happy to go look for something specific. What did you want to look for? What do I want to look for? And let's sort of set our brains and our eyes working together so that we're more likely to find what we're looking for, including good things, right? Not just anomalies. If we don't do that, what will happen is myself and the person I'm touring with is immediately when we find something that is wrong, so to speak, maybe it could be something simple like cords strewn across a walkway, we both get really excited to sort of correct that, but we might miss pretty significant serious injury fatality exposures nearby because we're so focused on this particular one. So it's important to decide what you're looking for when you go out and have a look. It's great to look broadly, but it's also important to really focus in there as well. When we talk about situational awareness, the reality is most people don't take full control of their attention. So there's more we could do to get an even better result from an attention point of view, because we just tend to miss things and we kind of go with the gist. We take a quick look around a work environment, and then if we don't see anything that's obvious, we sort of switch off our looking and move on to the next thing, where we may have missed some really important exposures and left people at risk along the way. I would liken this sort of shift, if you want, sort of upgrading the quality of our situational awareness. It's kind of like turning up the volume on your attention. Whenever I am over in the sort of South Africa area, which I haven't been lately, but I do like to go over and have a look at the lions over that way. And you get up early and you go and you have a look at these sleeping lions, these cats that are laid across rocks. And once they wake up, it's pretty amazing to see, and you may have seen this yourself, it's pretty amazing to see how they sort of come alive. And you can actually see their pupils foveate. If you've got a good camera or a good set of binoculars, you can see these animals really just intensify their focus as they look for lunch and start their day. Human beings can do a version of this as well. We just often don't. So we can notice much more from an exposure standpoint than we do with really minimal effort, just by learning about how to do this and then just making it part of our day. That's pretty easy strategies to teach people how to get more from their attention. Yeah. When we look at things that we could do along the way, you'll see the first one I just mentioned there, teaching deep noticing skills to the workforce. So rather than just sort of, the quick scan, let's actually use a particular technique that's known to work really well to notice hazards. Hunting as well for specific issues, super important. Checklists are great. I know a lot of people don't like checklists. There's sort of a worldwide movement away from checklists, I've noticed as well. But the reality is, I like when the pilot of my airplane is using a checklist and having a look in one, as they go around the plane, looking for blemishes in the skin of the aircraft, because we'll miss things along the way. So for critical tasks, it's important to have some rigor around how we detect issues in our environment and maintain really good focus there. You'll see the reference to brain aligning documents as well. And then the last point there, using creative visuals that guide us towards a safe situation. Great things that we can do with signage and interacting with signage as well. Just the simple flipping of a sign as you walk into a work area is just a really basic way to have people pay more attention as their exposure increases as they walk into a particular work area. Now, we've saved our last brain-centered hazard that we'll cover here today as we go into cognitive fatigue. So a few things to talk about here. Again, we could spend the day talking about cognitive fatigue. We'll spend a few minutes. So when we look at cognitive fatigue, obviously the reason that it's a big deal is it's a known precursor to serious injury, fatality, and high-consequence accidents. Many accidents all around the world with well-documented contributions from fatigue. We just haven't restored our brain with delta wave sleep, deep sleep, kind of like plugging your cellular telephone into the wall. We just have to plug in, recharge, so that we're able to maintain focus, make good decisions, and maintain good situational awareness. When we look at, what's the issue with cognitive fatigue, it's really around sleep length and quality. I've become quite militant in my older age as I sit here in a hotel room at this moment in making sure that there's no light in the room while I'm sleeping. I'll black out the alarm clocks, things like that. There's a particular part of our brain called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, no reason to remember that, that is responsible for detecting what's happening for us right now. Are we going to sleep? Are we waking up? And so artificial light that's all around us, including the blue light from our cell phones and whatnot, can and does interact with this part of our brain and can impact the quality length of our sleep as well. I've just popped in a couple of slides here that I thought would be helpful, likely for sharing back where you work, if you haven't already shared such information before, but sort of useful, user-friendly information when we look at sleep and how that's, if we don't get good sleep, it puts us in a bad way. As you can see here, relative risk for error is 230% greater with 5.5 to 6.4 hours of sleep. So we want to keep in mind this sort of zone here. That's a pretty common sleep for many busy professional people working in industry, and so there's the watch out there. We're not at our best. We're not able to perform in the way that we normally do. Take it a step further and reduce our sleep down below 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours is a little bit of a marker that we want to keep in mind. If we're 5 times more likely from a risk to error issue, it's just not worth it. So if we've got something really important going on the next day, as we often do, we really want to pay respect to the human brain and make sure that we are kind of operating by its principles. What you'll see here on the next slide is an example of a rested brain versus a sleep-deprived brain. And you'll see on the left-hand side, the rested brain, look at all that red oxygenated blood. That's the way we're meant to be. But the sleep-deprived brain, you'll see it looks quite different. So just functionally, we're not able to perform when we haven't had, a good sleep. Let's call 8 hours sleep. There's many questions that can come up around how much sleep do we need, and does it change in old age? And again, we could have a whole other webinar on that. So, and happy to answer questions along the way here in just a moment. But when we look at, so what can we do from a fatigue perspective? What I will say is that there's a lot of organizations that are already, addressing the fatigue risk, which is great. There's a lot of organizations that don't. And when we look at why that is, it's interesting because it can feel like it's a little bit daunting for organizations. Where do we start? And is this a can of worms that we want to open up? I've heard these things said. And the reality is the fatigue risk management space is kind of like a swimming pool. It's got a deep end and it's got a shallow end. But you want to be swimming in the pool. You want to be addressing fatigue risk. You want to be addressing this and reducing it. Does everything need to be done, this year, the snap of the fingers? That's up to the business in terms of how we go about addressing fatigue risk. But you'll see on the slide here, there's a few things that we definitely want to get after to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. A good place to start is to have a look at what's our policy? What's our stance on allowing fatigue risk within our business. What are we doing about it? That's a good place to start to get a feel for where are we at as a business right now, and how do we look at this risk. Providing training about fatigue is great as well, of course. Having a look at work schedules, making sure there's no structural fatigue. That is, if we're asking people to actually come to work in a way that would build fatigue naturally, it's nothing that they've done from a lifestyle point of view. It's just built into the schedule that people will be fatigued and not well rested. Some easy things to address there. Assessing individual fatigue risk. So rather than just asking, "Are you okay?" Well, we could actually do within 10 minutes. We could do a fatigue risk assessment on a colleague and have that be related to the policy that we have in place. That this is a way that we keep people safe and well. Doesn't mean we send everybody home. You're fatigued, so you're out of here. No, not at all. What level of fatigue are you at? And what's the business's decision about how we're going to address this? Maybe we give you some lower risk, lower exposure tasks to do, or maybe you do need not to be here. But it's up to the business to make these decisions proactively, and these are good things to get after. Yeah. I'll move down to that next slide as we sort of close out our time here together. From our point of view, when we look at human performance reliability, in order to get really measurable outcomes, we've got to have leaders involved, obviously. We've got to have individuals working and employees empowered. But really important that safety and human performance becomes part of the DNA of the workforce. It's the biggest thing that we see is that when people don't understand human performance reliability, things like the brain-centered hazards, when they don't understand and it's not part of their day, that they're thinking, today's the day that I'll likely make an error because I'm a human, and so what am I going to do about it? If we're not looking through that lens as an organization, we tend to have things pop up that are quite nasty, from fatalities and serious injuries. Even amongst the sort of most knowledgeable people in businesses in the safety industry, it's important that it's part of our day and part of how we go, and that's a little bit different than what we see everywhere. And that's the end.
Now, David, I've got some great questions. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions, David? That I've got.
Absolutely, let's do it.
One here is, how can you stimulate a worker to switch from fast brain to the slow brain while doing habitual tasks?
Well, that's a great question. Oftentimes, what's really sort of a helpful place to start is, well, what are the critical tasks that a person's going to be doing today, or that even occur on our site? What are the things that we have to get right? And if we're not able to have a fail-safe be in place or automate something, we need people to switch on. We're going to want to put a prompt, which can come in lots of different forms. It can be just a quick activity where people switch on their slow brain just by asking some questions, having a quick discussion. So it depends on the situation, but what you're wanting to do is actually build it in there. I'll give you another example. So for a critical task that is where people actually have to have an SOP in hand and actually follow a sort of step-by-step procedure, what we often have in place is there's actual pause points that are listed within the SOP, and they actually link to and reference particular brain-centered hazards. Such as, so we know that at this stage in this task, it's likely that you would be fatigued, just from the heat and from the duration that it's taken here along the way, and so there can be guidance that goes along with that. It can also be referenced to distraction and some other things, depending on the situation. But the prompts are usually quite custom. So it's good to involve the workforce in, hey, how could we put something in place to make sure that we get a good change effect. The last thing that I'll say on that one is there's really interesting things you can read to do with nudge theory. It's a great book called Nudge as well. Our point, we have a little bit of a different point of view on nudge and nudges, and it's really slight, but it's really important. What we don't ever want to do is we don't want to create nudges without other people knowing what they are, because it will feel to people like something's being done to them. There's a group of people manipulating the situation, even if it's for good, right? It's for safety, but we always want to be collaborative about this. It's not about fixing people or changing people. It's about, hey, what could we do? Because anybody in this situation probably would be in their fast brain by now. So what do you want to do about it? Thanks for the question, Warren.
And David, a really interesting one from Pam. How do you suggest providing advice to businesses who feel they've fulfilled their safety responsibilities by having extensive policies, even if they're never read? And she's saying, I have found businesses can become resistant to fresh concepts as they have investment in the policy suite they've invested in, but this also shifts the responsibility to the worker in the employer's eyes. Any suggestions to address that?
Another great question. So it really comes down to that whole, compliance versus commitment. If we're just focused, as a business on kind of meeting legal or contractual requirements, which are great things to do, of course, but from a cultural point of view, it'll be important to consider, what's the implication of that? Most of the work that I do is very much focused on commitment. So it's going well and truly above and beyond, what the legal requirements are today. An example would be, again, with the SOPs. Any work that we do to brain align SOPs, all of the people that we work with would pass any audit. Usually, we'll say, as a qualifier, usually would pass any audit. But it's not about passing an audit. It's about innovation and how do we keep people safer. And so it really does come down to sort of the culture as led by the leaders of the business around, what could be. I have found it to be very helpful to talk about safety as a business metric as well. So I obviously do this because it's the right thing to do. I don't want people to die and to be hurt. There's also a business performance metric. So when people are focused on doing things well and continually improving, usually transcends into other areas of the business as well.
Thanks, David. From Corinne, she asks, if the thalamus has been desensitized to risk, taking behaviour during a specific activity, can the baseline be reset?
Another great question. Absolutely. So anybody can begin to sort of raise attention to issues that maybe haven't been raised before. I suppose I do it professionally as someone that does consulting all around the world. I will see things that need more attention, but that maybe people aren't giving it enough attention just through sort of habit and some sort of erosion that's happened over the years. So once we start to call it out and we kind of create a bit of a call to action and a coalition of people to keep a focus on it, to me that's what great safety is all about. I literally just today came from working with a great group of people. Their safety performance is going very well, just exemplary performance. They're very happy with things. And yet the conversation was about, okay, so what are we doing to evidence that this will continue to occur in the future? So reliably, will this continue year on year on year on year? And let's look at that dashboard. Let's look at those metrics to see, leading metrics that is, to see that we're headed in the right direction and we're doing the things that we need to do to manage exposure and continue to sort of win in the safety space.
And David, I've got time for one or two more, I think. From Mel, she's asking, is it okay for us now we've done this session to talk in terms of fast brain, slow brain, social brain with our workforce, say as part of being out and about in the work areas?
Absolutely. Yep. So those concepts are not trademark concepts. We have introduced them into the market globally to sort of make sure that people are kept safer by using common language rather than sort of convoluted academic human performance language. As a human performance specialist myself, I will admit to loving to sit and read neuroscience journals on the weekend until my wife tells me to put them down. However, I can really appreciate that that's not palatable to everyone, and people don't have time for that as well. So how can we get big things done by really bringing it down to a level of usefulness? Yeah? Not to say that we shouldn't focus on academics, we should, but when it comes down to it, we need the people and the tools and the leaders who support those people to be able to get it right and do the work effectively to save lives. And so anything that we can do to make that palatable and a bit fun as well and interesting, this is a helpful go.
And I'm just going to squeeze one more in. From Amy, can you provide any suggestions for designing inspections or checklists to reduce risks of missing issues while still ensuring the intent of the inspection checklist being achieved?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great book called Checklist Manifesto, which is a great start around sort of designing great checklists. We obviously do consulting in this area as well, sort of brain-aligned checklists so that when people are going through them, they're less likely to make errors. So an example would be, it's great that airline pilots and other people use checklists while they, check things out, so to speak. But that actually can become quite fast-brained as well. So there's ways to infuse neuroscience into those checklists so that it's more likely people won't make an error and will stay focused as they complete them. So we can help you with that, but that book is a good place to start.
Thanks, David. And given it's 12 o'clock, in fact at 12:01, I'm going to hand back to Jordan. Are you there, Jordan?
Yes, I'm there. Thank you to our speakers for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending the webinar. You are encouraged to submit feedback by clicking on the yellow icon in the top right corner of your screen. You will also be redirected to this survey shortly. We thank you in advance for your feedback and wish you a great afternoon.
Thanks all. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Good to meet you.